Hi my friends, let's continue this extremely important course and let's have a look at some new collocations. Firmly believe. Alright, it can be said strongly believe, it's also possible. However, this expression sounds more advanced, so let's use it. Firmly believe. I really believe that it all depends on you. I firmly believe that it all depends on you. You know that we can say it depends on you or it's up to you. It's all up to you. Anyway, we try to use words like, completely, totally, and some others. And there is one more absolutely amazing expression, totally up to you. It will be, it's totally up to you. It means that it depends on you completely. Look, I firmly believe that it's totally up to you. I firmly believe that it's totally up to you. I firmly believe that it's totally, not totally, totally up to you. I firmly believe that it's totally up to you. I really believe that you don't really need to do it. I firmly believe that you don't really need to do it. Alright, I have a question. What can be changed in the second part of the sentence? You don't really. What can be used instead of really? You don't listen necessarily. You don't necessarily need to do it. What does it mean? It means the following, that it isn't necessary to do it. You don't necessarily need to do it. You don't necessarily need to do it. I firmly believe that you don't necessarily need to do it. I firmly believe. Firmly believe. I firmly believe that it's totally up to you. I firmly believe that you don't necessarily need to do it. Fiercely competitive. We know the expression highly competitive. However, this expression sounds much stronger when the competition is really fierce, is really so strong. Fiercely competitive. Let's use it here. We all see it's a very competitive market. We all see, right? This structure is quite simple. For instance, we can say as we all see. It sounds better. As we all see, it's a highly, or if the level of competition is even stronger, is even higher, it can be it's a fiercely competitive market. As we all see, it's a fiercely competitive market. As we all see, it's a fiercely competitive market. So the competition is really fierce, is really so aggressive. If you do business in a very competitive market, it can become quite risky. Okay, you see, in a very competitive market, to make it sound stronger, we can do the following. We can say in a highly competitive market or in a fiercely, if the competition is really so strong, if it's incredibly strong. However, we aren't going to stop, just by changing this expression. What else can be done here? Look, if you do business, alright, it's present simple. Let's try to use gerund here. Let's try to use a more advanced grammar structure, gerund. So if you do business or doing business, look, doing business in a fiercely competitive market, it can become, or don't forget about phrasal verbs. They are also hugely important, extremely important. It can become, or it can turn out. It can turn out quite risky. If we're talking about grammar, it can be said, it can turn out, or it can turn out to be. That's alright too. Look, doing business in a fiercely competitive market, it can turn out to be quite risky. We all see how the language changes when we add more advanced vocabulary, and we see a great difference here. Doing business in a fiercely competitive market, it can, without it, because we see doing business in a fiercely competitive market can turn out to be quite risky. So if we didn't have, gerund in the first part of the sentence, for instance, if we do business in a fiercely competitive market, we can say it can turn out. If we don't have, a structure like it was in the beginning, and if we are going to use this structure doing business, so we don't need to use it here, and it will be as it is. Doing business in a fiercely competitive market can turn out to be quite risky. And really, it's absolutely amazing when we can show our real knowledge, our real skills of using phrasal verbs. Fiercely competitive. As we all see, it's a fiercely competitive market. Doing business in a fiercely competitive market can turn out to be quite risky. Next, particularly interested, or very interested, really interested, greatly interested, particularly interested. I'm really interested in it. I am particularly interested in it. Let's have a look at how this word sounds. Particularly. Particularly. I'm particularly interested in it. I'm really interested in learning foreign languages. I'm particularly interested in learning foreign languages. I'm particularly interested in learning foreign languages. Particularly interested. I'm particularly interested in it. I'm particularly interested in learning foreign languages. Particularly like, or really like. Particularly like. I really like these kind of things. I particularly like these kind of things. I particularly like these kind of things. I particularly like these kind of things. I really like all this because there are no certain limits here. I particularly like all this because there are no certain limits here. However, it can be said another way. Look. What? How will you continue? What I particularly like about all this is that, Or what I particularly dislike about all this is that. What I particularly like about all this is that. If we compare this structure with the previous structure, we see a great difference here. It's a much more advanced structure, by the way. What I particularly like about all this is that there are no certain limits here. What I particularly like about all this is that there are no certain limits here. What I particularly like about all this is that there are no certain limits here. Particularly like. I particularly like these kind of things. What I particularly like about all this is that there are no certain limits here. Particularly keen. We say interested in, particularly interested in, but particularly keen on. Particularly keen on. I'm really keen on music. Or I'm particularly keen on music. I'm particularly keen on music. I'm particularly keen on music. I'm really keen on watching movies in English. I'm particularly keen on watching movies in English. I'm particularly keen on watching movies in English. Particularly keen on. I'm particularly keen on music. I'm particularly keen on watching movies in English. Particularly important. We know the expressions hugely important, vitally important. It can also be said particularly important. Let's use this expression here. Particularly important. This kind of work is so important. This kind of work is particularly important. This kind of work is particularly important. It's so important if it's about money. It's particularly important if it's about money, or you are trying to use a phrasal verb here. It'll be using the verb come if it's right about money, or as they say, when it comes to money. When it comes to money. When it comes to money. It implies if it's about money. If it's about or when it comes. When it comes to money or when it comes to a certain subject. It's particularly important when it comes to money. It's particularly important when it comes to money. It's particularly important when it comes to money. Particularly important. This kind of work is particularly important. It's particularly important when it comes to money. Particularly worried. Particularly worried. I'm so worried about it. Or I'm really worried about it. I'm particularly worried about it. I'm particularly worried about it. I'm particularly worried about it. He's so worried about his future. He's particularly worried about his future. He's particularly worried about his future. He's particularly worried about his future. Particularly worried. I'm particularly worried about it. He's particularly worried about his future. Utterly ridiculous or absolutely ridiculous. We use utterly when it's mostly a negative meaning. Utterly ridiculous. Utterly ridiculous. So ridiculous. It's really ridiculous. Or it's utterly ridiculous. It's utterly ridiculous. It's utterly ridiculous. These comments are really ridiculous. These comments are utterly ridiculous or absurd. These comments are utterly ridiculous or absurd. I mean this word, absurd. These comments are utterly ridiculous. utterly ridiculous. It's utterly ridiculous. These comments are utterly ridiculous. They're so strange. Utterly impossible. Utterly impossible. It's really impossible. If the idea is that it's absolutely impossible and no way can it happen. Look, it's an inversion again. So no way, and then we need to use an inversion here. No way can it happen. So we see the opposite word here. Utterly impossible. Look, utterly. It's much stronger. It has a much stronger meaning. I mean this expression. It's really impossible or it's utterly impossible. It means it's absolutely impossible. It's utterly impossible. It's utterly impossible. Well, we can say it's absolutely impossible. If you say it's absolutely impossible, so this level is, between B2 and C1. So you have to agree that this expression, the expression utterly impossible, is typical of more advanced students. So many of us know absolutely impossible, absolutely amazing, absolutely magnificent, but few of us know this expression, this one, utterly impossible. And that's a great difference which we see here. It's utterly impossible. It's utterly impossible. It was really impossible at the time. It was utterly impossible at the time. It was utterly impossible at the time. It was utterly impossible at that time. Utterly impossible. It's utterly impossible. It was utterly impossible at that time. Utterly miserable. So sad. Means that someone is so sad, or that someone is so unhappy. Utterly miserable. Utterly miserable. As we could see, she was very sad. Or she was so sad. As we could see, she was utterly miserable. As we could see, she was utterly miserable. She looked so sad. She looked utterly miserable. She looked utterly miserable. Utterly miserable. As we could see, she was utterly miserable. She looked utterly miserable. Utterly absurd or utterly ridiculous. These remarks seem really absurd. These remarks seem utterly absurd. These remarks seem utterly absurd. These remarks seem utterly absurd. When I start thinking about his behavior, I think that it's really absurd. When I start thinking about his behavior, so I believe that it isn't a good idea to repeat this word think. Let's replace it. For instance, we can say, I come to the conclusion. I come to the conclusion. Right. Let's try to use much more advanced vocabulary. I come to the conclusion that it's utterly absurd. When I start thinking about his behavior, I come to the conclusion that it's utterly absurd. When I start thinking about his behavior, I come to the conclusion that it's utterly absurd. Utterly absurd. These remarks seem utterly absurd. When I start thinking about his behavior, I come to the conclusion that it's utterly absurd. Utterly wrong or completely wrong. Completely is mostly typical of intermediate students. In contrast to this expression, utterly wrong, it's C1, C2, utterly wrong. As a result, we can use it here to sound like supremely confident, advanced English speakers. Utterly wrong. I think that he's completely wrong. I think, or, for instance, it seems to me. It seems to me that he's utterly wrong. It seems to me that he's utterly wrong. It seems to me that he's utterly wrong. I have to say that I was really wrong. I have to say, well, we can leave it as it is, or think about, an alternative to this word, to say, or maybe to add, or to confess. I have to confess. I have to confess that I was utterly wrong. I was so wrong. I have to confess that I was utterly wrong. I have to confess that I was utterly wrong. Utterly wrong. It seems to me that he is utterly wrong. I have to confess that I was utterly wrong. Utterly unable or completely unable. It means that someone can't do something no matter how hard he or she tries. Utterly unable. Utterly unable. He is really unable to cope with such serious difficulties. He is utterly unable to cope with such serious difficulties. He is utterly unable to cope with such serious difficulties. They are really unable to understand the difference between right and wrong. They are utterly unable to understand the difference between right and wrong. Well, how can it be said another way? To understand the difference or to distinguish. To distinguish right from wrong. To understand the difference or to distinguish. To distinguish right from wrong. They are utterly unable to distinguish right from wrong. They are utterly unable to distinguish right from wrong. Utterly unable. He is utterly unable to cope with such serious difficulties. They are utterly unable to distinguish right from wrong. Utterly appalling. Really terrible. Utterly appalling or really terrible. Very bad. Extremely bad. Utterly appalling. They lived in very bad conditions earlier. They lived in utterly appalling conditions earlier. What about the structure used to? I hope that you remember it. They used to live in utterly appalling conditions. They used to live in utterly appalling conditions. They used to live in utterly appalling conditions. All the atmosphere there was really terrible. All the atmosphere there was utterly appalling. Utterly appalling. All there, or the whole atmosphere there was utterly appalling. We don't see a great change, in the meaning here. We just want to show our real knowledge of the level C1. So, we're trying to use this kind of vocabulary. The whole atmosphere there was utterly appalling. The whole atmosphere there was utterly appalling. Utterly appalling. They used to live in utterly appalling conditions. The whole atmosphere there was utterly appalling. Utterly stupid. Very stupid. Or extremely stupid. It can sound a bit rude. He says it's a very stupid thing. Or it's such a stupid thing. He says it's an utterly stupid thing. He says it's an utterly stupid thing. He says it's an utterly stupid thing. He looked really stupid after what he had said. He looked... If he looked so stupid or extremely stupid, we can say he looked utterly stupid. He looked utterly stupid after what he had said. He looked utterly stupid after what he had said. Utterly stupid. He says it's an utterly stupid thing. He looked utterly stupid after what he had said. You know, sometimes we can hear, "What an utterly stupid question." I firmly believe that if students have questions, it means that their brain is in constant work, and that's perfect. That's perfect. It's a sign of wisdom, but not a sign of stupidity. Let's continue this incredibly intensive English course. See you soon. Bye-bye.